So hello everyone and welcome to Reuters Breaking Views Predictions, part of the annual global series unveiling key shifts and market moving event for the year. So all what we should all be paying attention to. I'm Nicole Guillermo, account director of France for Wefinitiv, and I'm very pleased to be here tonight given our strong relationship with Reuters to provide our clients with their news and content. Our ongoing partnership is key in an area of muddled truth, fake news, tumultuous geopolitics, shifting markets. It is really crucial for our clients to have access to all the impartial, industry-leading news and content from Reuters, so that they are really armed to have the insights to manage their own businesses. So I'm especially interested in Reuters breaking views each year, given the impactful insight into what will impact all the markets and our customers over the course of the year. And tonight we will really focus on going global à la française and how companies, French companies, have aggressively expanded abroad, creating some of the world's most successful multinational companies. So I'm looking forward now to hearing the feedback and the experiences of our tonight panel. And having said that, please join me in welcoming Rob Cox, global editor of Reuters Breaking View.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Nicole. Am I mic'd in, or should I use this thing? Yeah. Thanks everybody for coming tonight. This is the seventh in this year's series of predictions. We've done. I'm gonna have to refer to my notes because I can't remember the many ones we've done. We've done New York, London, Toronto, Hong Kong, Davos last week, and Mumbai. We take the show on the road to Milan on Wednesday, and then I drop from exhaustion. But it's the second time we've done it in Paris, and it's a more intimate setting, but it's a little bit like I don't know, filming an episode of a television show, because we have a small group of people here. Very important. Thank you for coming, but we are live streaming this on the internet, and then we'll have lots of other people watching. It's a bit like an episode of Friends, right? There's a small studio audience, but. So we have a couple of housekeeping notes. So I'm going to ask you guys to do a little bit of work, and people out in the world to do a little bit of work, which is to do two things. One, Matt, maybe you could throw that slide up, so we can show people what to do. If you go to Slido, there's going to be a place where you can actually vote on a couple of things that we're asking people. We've asked people the same question with one variation, well, slight variations, but one real variation. There it is. Well, it says in case of fire, panic. Go online if you want the Wi-Fi, join the conversation. Let's go to the next one, Matt, so we can show people how to do this. Yeah, so you go to the Slido thing. It's kind of cool. You can vote in real time, and we'll show people the results of the vote. And I actually like to do it because we can compare how people in these different cities respond to the same question. And that's kind of fun. Why don't we try with the first one, just to make sure you guys all know how to do this. I'm going to do it myself. So go to slido.com, and you should be able to see what to do there. It'll give you the question. The first question, we put that up. It's not working with your mic. Okay, all right. Is there a problem with all the mics or just my mic? Just mine, okay. So do I have to repeat all that, or are we good?
No, you're good.
We're good.
So if you go to the next slide, you'll see the first question. Can we put that up there? Okay, yeah. Which economy will deliver the biggest upside surprise in 2020? If you go and ask that under polls, you can see it. You have an option of choosing the United States, China, France, or India. So far, not too many votes, but I'm going to make a vote in there. There we go. Okay.
That's true.
All right. Well, you can continue to vote on this if you're still getting your things together. There we go. Shall we should we just test the others question? Why not? This one's kind of fun. We'll go to the next question, but go to that. So who will win the U.S. presidential elections? You have a choice of Elizabeth Warren or Donald Trump, Mike Bloomberg, Elizabeth Warren, the senator from Massachusetts. You have Joe Biden, the former vice president, Barack Obama, and Bernie Sanders, the senator from the great state of Vermont. So let's see what people say. I will tell you, it's sort of an obvious question. There's one guy who's already got the job, so mathematically you're all going to choose Donald Trump. We asked the question differently in New York, I'll have you know. We said, who would you vote for? Their former mayor and my former boss, Mike Bloomberg. So anyway, I thought that was kind of funny. Okay, so I'll let you guys continue to vote. And now, if you want to ask questions, and this is the same for our friends out in the on the internet. If you want to ask questions, you go to Slido as well. You can see it on there. If you look on that app, you might think I work for Slido, given the advertising I'm doing for them. But you can ask a Q&A there. You can ask a question. It's a little bit easier than running around with a mic, although we have a pretty small room here, so that's fine. Okay. So without further ado, we've done the housekeeping. I appreciate you all coming here. You know, sort of thinking about predictions. You see the book that you all have on your seats there. It's as the new decade kicks off, it sort of wouldn't be very hyperbolic to say that things are heating up. Asset prices are kind of ridiculously high, or records highs. You can say ridiculous. I say ridiculous. Turmoil is still coming back to us all around the world. The Middle East, not the worst of it. Trade tensions are tense between all the world's economies, even though we have this stage one agreement between the United States and China. All the while, the planet is actually warming, and that's going to affect businesses, not to mention all of us, in ways that we can't really comprehend. That's why we've titled the book, as you'll see, Turning Up the Heat, A Pivotal Year for Profit, Politics, and the Planet. And as you can see from the image on the front, it's a picture of the burning Amazon. We're positioning climate change as a major and in really increasing threat to financial markets, economies, and really humanity. We've written about the Australian bushfires. We've written about those in Brazil and California. They're all human and ecological tragedies that encompass precisely the challenges that accompany global warming, and which we're trying to address in our journalism and in this year's prediction series. So while we touch on this topic, we don't take it lightly, even though some people thought, turning up the heat was some sort of a cliche meant to minimize in some way the damage that we see, and it's of course not. Tonight we're going to talk, as Nicole was saying, about French companies, French capitalism. They've expanded aggressively abroad. They've created some incredibly successful multinational companies. But while there's this wider debate raging about in the wider investment world between sort of shareholder capitalism and stakeholder capitalism, I thought it would be interesting to talk about where does French capitalism stand to this? How do French firms see this thing? And I couldn't have had really anyone better than the group of panelists we have here tonight. I'll ask each of you to come up as I introduce you. I'll start with you. Virginie Morgon is the chief executive of Eurazeo, a leading global investment firm with 10 offices worldwide, and obviously in Paris, New York, Shanghai, London, Seoul, Sao Paulo. You've got 18 billion euros of assets under management. And you are a Knight of the Legion of Honor and a Knight of the National Order of Merit, so I will not mess with you. Does that mean you carry a sword?
I'm not wearing it because it's red on red.
Okay, but there's no sword or anything I have to worry about. That's good. I'll start with Mike. Okay, Michael's getting up, so let's go for Michael. He's a founding partner of the firm that bears his name, Zowie & Co., which he set up a few years ago with his brother Yoel. Before that, Michael spent nearly 3 decades at Morgan Stanley, becoming a vice chairman and leading some of the two.
Please.
Michael's really young. Let me just say that out loud. But he worked on some of the biggest M&A deals involving many French companies. And 2 years ago, was it you fulfilled your other dream, which is when you conducted the Aurora Orchestra at Queen Elizabeth Hall. Mm-hmm. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Stéphane Bougenin is the chief executive and chairman of the management board of Euronext, which operates the stock exchanges of 6 major European economies and recently added a 7th with the Oslo Bourse, maybe un otro in España. We'll see. Stéphane is a trained lawyer, former investment banker, and an advisor to the Sarkozy government on getting the French economy to grow. So thank you. And Anne, I'll get you to come up. Anne Bouvereau is the chairperson of the board of Technicolor, a world leader in film processing, visual effects, and animation services, and a supplier of set-top boxes. She's also co-founder and chair of the Fondation Abiona, focused on data science for fairness and equality. And you see is also a doctor of artificial intelligence, so that sounds frightening. But thank God there's somebody who can walk us through all that. And you're also a knight, right? So
2 lady knights. Very good.
2 lady knights.
Very good.
Okay, so everybody can sit. I know everybody sort of stand. Do you want to sit or stand? What do you think?
I stand.
You oh, that's what a knight does. Okay, well, good.
I stand.
So look, let's just think about some of this. Right now, there's this. You were just in Davos, Virginie. So I'm going to throw you the first question. You know, the theme of it was stakeholder capitalism. I mean, what does France bring to that conversation and that sort of debate between the sort of primacy of the shareholder and then this other view, which is that we need to have all stakeholders involved? I mean, France seems to have a slightly different model than both. It's neither here nor there. How do you see it?
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me tonight. We had a great week in Davos, as usual, dense and rich and tiring. I think France, okay, from the shareholder perspective, I actually think that in some Anglo-Saxon countries you have way more power given to the shareholders, way more decision go through the EGM. A lot in France go through the board, so you better be sure that you have a responsible, committed, professional board. As far as stakeholders are concerned and sharing the value with a larger number of stakeholders, being employees, being other third parties, I think there's nothing we should envy in other countries. I'm comparing the US and France. I think we are way more advanced in a number of policies, strong commitments. I'm talking ESG, I'm talking women's and gender balance and diversity. I'm talking a number of direction in which France in particular, but also Europe, I believe has been more champion than what I can see in the US. I think we should just be slightly not concerned, but cautious, not to bring too much regulation, to have too many rules and regulation on our shoulders as French or European companies, which puts us as a big negative compared to some US companies, which has way less. And I think we can do a lot without too many regulation. Sometimes it's needed, but so I'm pretty proud. I think we can bring, and next we talk about internationalization, but we can bring a lot outside France and Europe in terms of stakeholder and shareholder value creation.
Stéphane, I mean, how do you see it from? I mean, Virginie mentions regulators. You're not. There's a fair amount of self-regulation that happens with the stock markets, of course. But I mean, how do you explain? You now in 7 markets in Europe. You've obviously operated in other places. I mean, do you think that France is sort of when you think about continental capitalism, as it were, is sort of the model?
Well, first of all, there is a fun fact, which is that when you deallocate 57% of your GDP to public expenses and you collect 46% of the GDP in taxes, it's a sort of paradise of ESG. Because by nature, companies, households, contribute a lot to a body that distributes and works for the common good. So jokes apart, I think we operate in France in a very interesting environment where we don't have foundations or trust as powerful as in the Netherlands, for example, another very important market of the Euronext construct. We don't have a state as a shareholder which is as powerful as it used to be. In fact, the state today owns 2% of the CAC 40, and directionally, the stakes are decreasing, as illustrated by the Française des Jeux IPO recently and other announcements. But fundamentally, the companies have found a narrow path to reconcile performance, and I think later today we will discuss the amazing performance of French blue chips that have found a way to capture growth from the rest of the world, and at the same time to have their models accepted locally. So things like the amazing growth of employees shareholding is pretty unique at this level. And when I refer to, there are some extreme cases where these stakes have reached more than 15% or even more, and that's pretty impressive. And it's not that common, and that's the outcome of a sort of piling up of rules, and since the late 60s, since the first laws of General de Gaulle on intéressement et participation. So the idea of being accepted by the ecosystem of business is pretty impressive. You know, one of the fun facts which is interesting is that when the Gilets jaunes uprising started last year, their target was the political level. Interestingly enough, except branches of banks, they didn't turn really against business. So the paradox is that there is an acceptance of the corporate world. Now, at company level, you might have here and there issues, but the idea that companies can find a way to and again, it's a matter of negotiation where you need to segregate the messaging from the reality. But when you look at labor law in France and union in France, the reality is that it's easier to restructure, to use the sort of politically correct language, in French companies than it is in other countries in Europe, because adjustments have been piled up since, let's say, over the past 10 years, and the outcome of all those reforms has been significantly impressive. So it's not perfect, but there is a sort of way to navigate in a set of constraints that allow growth and acceptability by the social environment. And hence the concept of la raison d'être, or the purpose, that is now, they have found a way to make it optional for the ones who really don't mind, etc. So if you want to understand the root of value creation in this country, you need first to filter perception from reality.
Right. Michael, I mean, you've been operating in global finance all your life. I mean, but you're a Frenchman at heart. I mean, and you've now set up the company with your brother. 4 or 5 years, 6 years ago. How many years is it?
5 years ago.
Yeah, 5. So how do you define French capitalism, and particularly when you're dealing and sort of fighting sometimes and battling with global capitalists?
Well, let me give you the deal perspective on this, because as you kindly reminded everyone here, I've been around for many decades. and
I've known you for those many decades, so I'm as old as just
No, but jokes aside, the point I want to make is that the country has massively evolved from the early days when I first got here in the 90s, and Virginie was practicing the same business at another firm at the time, and there was a certain way of doing deals at the time, which was specific to this country. And I don't think we need to go through this because it's history, it's the past. The important thing is, as you look at the way things get done today, they are no different from any other developed markets or capital markets. When you do a takeover, when you do a merger, shareholders' considerations prevail on pretty much a very long list of issues. Valuation, relative parities, and other situations which have to do with governance but must be reflected also in the price, in the premium, in the lack of premium, etc. Exactly the same way you see that everywhere else. Period. It's that simple.
What is it different, you think, at the board level, Anne? I mean, obviously you're the chair of Technicolor, but you're on the Capgemini board, on the Edenred board. Is there something specific that one could consider French capitalistic governance?
Yeah, and I was thinking about what Virginie was saying. I agree that French governance and regulation and practices are very professional and very good. One of the areas where France is actually making progress, I think, is in the professionalization of the board. It's true that boards have a certain amount of power in France before the EGM takes the final decision on a number of things. We've been moving in France from the era of the PDG, the chair and CEO of the board, which was the main rule with the power in the hands of one person. And we've seen a couple examples of limits of that with Carlos Ghosn, for example, and with a couple others. But we're really moving more to a separation of those two roles and with a professionalization of people having seats on the board. And I think that's really going in the right direction. So that's something that is moving more towards the UK example, for example, of best corporate practice and becoming the norm in France.
I mean, one of the things as a journalist, having spent some time here last year, it was amazing to me how many multinational companies France has produced. I mean, you look relative to, say, Italy or some other, even Germany. There are some big car companies, and there are a few large engineering companies. But this goes across, all sort of sectors.
Number of sectors.
I mean, so let's sort of going back to the original question, like, what is it about? I don't know. Is it French culture, French business culture, French education? What is it? What are the ingredients that actually allow for companies French companies to expand on and sort of succeed on the global stage? I mean, you invest in a lot of them, so how do you see it?
Yeah, I mean, we started investing in French, then progressively in European companies, and about 4 years ago we started investing in US companies. So I mean, is there a French way? I mean, it's sort of not evident to answer. Are we well trained? Do we have amazing talent? The answer is yes. For sure, we can be super proud of the education system. We may be slightly lower ranked in the international ranking, but I think we have to be proud. We at Eurazeo, we invest in venture, in growth capital. There's so many amazing entrepreneurs to support, to help develop, to expand. So we can be very proud on the talent pool. We are actually more affordable. Yes. It's way less expensive to deploy and support a company in France. Same reasoning in Southern European countries with amazing talent pool and quality. You can be profitable more quickly. I'm talking venture and growth capital, way more quickly. I think second is that we have a small country compared to others. So you're deemed to go international. You have to go international. Some countries are smaller, so maybe they go first, but you can't just rely, just like in the US. It's changing now in some sectors, of course, in the US, but there's still companies who believe in the US that they can just deploy in the US, and that's enough because the addressable market is so big that you can happily grow without thinking international too quickly. I think in France, not only you couldn't at the time of the larger corporation, the sort of classic big strategic corporation. I'm thinking Air Liquide, Danone, L'Oréal, to name a few of the worldwide leaders who are French. I think in the venture, in growth, in entrepreneurial approach, the younger generation or the entrepreneurial generation, because there's not only young entrepreneurs, thanks God, they're thinking of going abroad like immediately. In dual track, so it's not sequential, it's immediate, and they move across. They go to the US, they go to wherever they see fit to expand their addressable markets. And then there must be a French way. I don't know. I mean, sometimes I'm not so proud about the French way. We have this way of turning back to French in 25 minutes. And leaving, alone all the non-French speaker everywhere in the world. I've
seen that. Yeah.
We could be, maybe really? Self-centered or selfish, or it's not a question of language because everybody. So, but there is a French way, and I think it's a mix of ambition, feeling no fear, You know, being sort of humble but aggressive at the same time.
Right.
No fear, ambition.
So
and
that's good for your business, Michael, if there's no fear and you've got, I mean, if you're doing the M&A business and trying to help them expand abroad, and I mean, is that, do you sense that there's a sort of daring do, a sort of, I don't know, je ne sais quoi?
Yeah, I love what Virginie said. I wish we could see that in the stats of M&A deals and French companies buying abroad, etc. But I do have an answer to your question, which is a bit more quantitative than the one Virginie just gave. Looking at facts, there are a couple of things which really struck me. One is that France has a very large density of large companies. When you compare it to other countries around Europe, it has something like 120 or 25 companies which have sales in excess or revenues in excess of $1.5 billion. That represents, so that's important, it's among the top in Europe, together with the UK and Germany. But interestingly, and contrary to those two countries, in France it's about 75%. Those companies account for about 75% of the total GDP. The next 1,500 companies account for 15%, something like that. So you have a scale effect. And by the way, in Germany, it's about 57% of the GDP, so much lower. In Italy or Spain, which don't have the same very large companies as you were referring to before, these companies account for about 20 to 30% of total GDP. So what does that mean? That means there's a scale effect. When you're large, by definition, you go outside. Or you're large also because you're outside. Exactly. Yeah. And roughly, when you look at the top, 40, 50 companies in this country, about a third, 30% of their revenues are produced outside. So the first thing is, if you're a small company, if you're still emerging, you're not outside yet. Although, yes, there's more initiative today, and people are doing this dual track, as you were saying before. But it's going to take some time. The second reason why I think the French companies are particularly strong abroad is that the strong sectors of this country are very well tailored to global markets. If you think about what the sectors are, they are the key sectors, the ones where we have leading positions. They are pharmaceuticals, which of course are global. They are luxury, and we know much about how global this is, given the rise of the Chinese consumer, etc. We don't need to go through this, obviously. They are consumer goods. You mentioned L'Oréal earlier, but that's another massively global market. Or there are car companies, which are also global.
Or oil and gas.
Oil and gas as well, etc. So all of the sectors in which France is very strong are global, and therefore necessitate global presence because their markets are out there. If you contrast this again with Spain, what are the big sectors in Spain? Construction, utility, energy. Those are very much more domestic.
They don't scale the same way.
Yeah.
They don't have that scale.
Yeah.
I mean, how do you look at it as from the stock exchange perspective? I mean, you've captured these 7 markets, of course, Stefan. But you know,
I'll come to the I'll come to the exchange in a minute. But just to give more numbers, because there is always a tendency to privatize profits and nationalize losses. The reason why we are where we are, with the reason why talents are what they are, is that every year this country spends 70 billion euros as a flow per year to train human capital. We spend 55 billion euros. It's a decision that is the most massive decision taken by taxpayers here, which is not really debated because it's so consensual. We spend 55 billion euros between kindergarten and high school, and then 15 billion for higher education and research. It's a lot of money, and as a flow. Now, it might be inefficient, it might be complicated, but you know, I'm here. My father was a factory worker. My parents have never spent €1 for my education. I have a son who is a son of an investment banker, and he went to NYU, and I paid $250,000 for his education, and I think yours too.
And next is Virginie's daughter.
So that's been piled up, accumulated for years and years. Bill Clinton said, talents are distributed in an even manner. opportunities are not distributed in an even manner. The purpose of politics is to bring talents to opportunities and bring opportunities closer to talents. That's one of the things. It's not perfect, but it is part of the consensus, and that allows training of talents.
So investment by the government is essentially what you're talking about, the ESG.
The second thing, exactly, that's connected with my, I mean, tout n'est pas à jeter. And the second point.
That was 25 minutes exactly.
The second point is about those companies. When you look into details, okay, you have L'Oréal and you have other companies that have done everything on their own. But fundamentally, why those blue chips are what they are? Because their management teams were committed to do one thing: punch above their weight. Going global is all about punching above your weight. Now, some of them did it with their own merits, but many of them were supported at some critical point of their history by taxpayers' money. And many of them were recapitalized at the time where they were weak, in the 80s. That was a side unwanted benefits of the nationalizations. Many of them were supported in a crisis manner. I mean, we all remember the story of it. There were many mistakes of wasted, burnt for nothing taxpayers' money. Don't get me wrong. I'm just saying that we should not privatize profits. And Total, as we know it, is the combination of ELF, which was a public company, state-owned company, for years. So there was always a phase where there was support from the rest of society. Now, the real defining factor has been the quality of management. And the quality, this last point I want to cover, the loyalty of employees. One of the things that makes French companies, global companies, so different from others is that the management of mercenaries is still, things are changing, but it's still less complicated than us. People join companies, they are not very well paid, they stay for long because they like their job, they like waking up at 5 o'clock in the morning, taking the plane, traveling across the globe or to the other side of Europe, coming back to at 11 o'clock, getting divorced after 20 years of marriage because
I'm not sure they like that.
blaming the job,
sure they like
blaming the job, whereas they would have divorced anyway.
Come on.
This commitment to the company is probably more unique, maybe vintage, I don't know, than in other places as well.
I think it's because you give away the lunch tickets to
if you
everybody.
look at stock exchange, well, it's very simple. I mean, last year the CAC 40 was plus 26%, and the FTSE was plus 12%. So the markets have decided.
Okay, the FTSE. Maybe that's it.
There's a different context maybe for the FTSE, but
and I mean, how do you see? I mean, you know, Technicolor is it's a French company in name, but it is, I mean, essentially.
It was initially a U.S. company. It's a U.S. brand that was acquired. But again, I'd go back to talent. I think a couple of us say that talent is absolutely key in the media and creative industries. We have l'École des Gobelins. We have a couple other schools that are really world famous to train people in graphic design, 3D animation, special effects, etc. Lots of the people who were trained there are actually now having jobs at DreamWorks, at Pixar, at Disney, of course at Technicolor, but they're the leaders in their field all around the world. It's true in AI as well. The head of R&D at Facebook is a French guy, Jérôme Pessanti, and Yann Lequin works there as well. So the talent thing, I think, is a very big one. And just to add a point to what Virginie said on venture and people having R&D teams in France, there's also the tax credit that goes for R&D, the Crédit Impôt Recherche, makes it on top of the salaries not being at the same level as in Silicon Valley. On top of that, you can claim the expenses you have in R&D for startups or for larger companies against your tax expenses. So I think all of that works very well to help use French talent for these global companies.
So let me be a bit of a downer though and ask.
Yes.
That is true. I mean, and we cited some amazing success stories with global French companies. I mean, LVMH, Kering in the luxury goods sector, among others. Why is there no tech champion? If you've got these great universities, if you're spending all this money in R&D, you're spending all this money on education, where's the tech? I mean, this is a European problem, frankly, but it is, you would think, given all the things we're saying about France, it would be, you would have some more examples of that. I mean, I know, and like
Yeah, a
continue.
couple thoughts on that. The first one is everybody says there's no young company in the French stock exchange. There are a couple younger companies. I mean, Edenred, we were just discussing that earlier, is a company that's not yet in the CAC 40, but I think that's one of the next ones to be there. It was created, it's a spin-off of another company in 2010. It's now one of the great successes of French multinational companies.
And that's in payments system.
And that's in payments, that's payment
which is
services.
super hot.
It used
And
to be
it's
your voucher
super hot.
business to launch.
So
Yeah,
we sold
that's
it
true.
probably really low, and now it's worth
sorry
10
about that.
times as much. Yeah.
And Capgemini just celebrated its 50th anniversary. They're a tech company. They're not a platform, but they're a tech company. So you have a few. But this being said, I agree with you. We don't have the large tech companies that the US or that China have. Part of it is it's a smaller national market, so you don't immediately have the ability to grow. Part of it is also, I think, our approach to regulation. We tend to want to see the potential effects of something before innovating. So we have some regulation around privacy, for example, that's very strong. That goes back to the 1978 IT and Freedom Law. That was the basis for actually what became the GDPR, because it was a French law, and then it was developed in France, and the person who was chairing the group of people in Europe looking at privacy influenced that regulation. That now Facebook and others are saying it's wonderful, we want it. But in the meantime, Facebook was created and grew and became huge, and it's something that is happening after the fact. Well, in France, we have a tendency to want to say, let's think about the consequences first, and then we'll see if we can innovate,
Europe
which is a bit of an issue.
Europe is certainly leading on the regulation of the tech platforms, for sure.
Yeah.
And GDPR, as you say, I didn't realize it had its origins in France, but you know, if you talk to the Facebooks and whatnot today, and you probably had heard it last week in Davos, I mean, they're all like, please bring GDPR to America, partly because they understand it. Maybe it's somewhat benign relative to what the alternatives. But Virginie, I mean, you invest in growth equity too. So I mean,
Yeah, I mean, to be maybe on sort of a positive note or tone, I think something is happening in Europe as we speak in growth capital. I think there's a lot to expect, and there's many reasons for that. I think there's less money going to the public market, more to the private market, private debt, private equity, venture growth. So that's the first trend, and we can come back to this and debate, but this is sort of what it is. There's way more private companies under private equity ownership or backed by private investors. Second, I think we've done a good job in a number of countries, including France, to nurture and grow the venture. For many, many, many years. So you have many players, very renowned, and competing with the US venture cap firms, but you didn't have
right? It's unfair to compare what France has achieved versus the GAFA, etc. The same applies to every other country. We in the Europe, we have not had the scale or indeed the early starter advantage of great capital markets and so on. So this is one point. Although we do have fantastic companies. Atos, Thales, Airbus, Safran, Ubisoft, Technicolor. I mean, there are lots of great names, and I think we will continue to see that developing. On specific M&A, when the Station F was inaugurated, and I had the pleasure of being there, Xavier Niel told me, you should take a booth here and just sit there, and in 10 years all of these companies are going to be for sale and you'll make gazillions of dollars, etc. To which I promptly replied, I don't think I have 10 years, but there we go.
You could send an intern.
I could send an intern, or I could turn to Anne and expect my first M&A mandate from from right next door. We could talk. But so this will take some time. But what I wanted to say specifically about France is I'm overwhelmed by the level of activity and encouragement in this country. So mentioned Station F. There's a Vivatech conference. There's a 5 billion private-public partnership funding recently announced. There's the next 40. There's so much going on in this country that I'm very optimistic. One number. I think in the first half of last year of 2019, 2.8 billion were raised for startups, etc., which is 43% higher than the year before.
Oh, that's
the story is good.
And counting.
And counting.
Yeah.
Exactly.
I have to say, because
Go for it.
out of the next 40, so the 40 next 40, we have 17 in Eurasia Group.
In your portfolio?
Good for you.
All right, well
All
done.
right.
But you actually raised a question, which is, sort of raised the question to me of the role of the state. So we haven't really kind of addressed it head on, but there is a role of the state in France, in capitalism, in the markets that has been unique. And is it help or does it hinder at this point, Michael?
Well, you need to look at the historical perspective, I think. There is a reason why, and I think we can all go back to Colbert and the 17th century, where France created a very strong state driving the economy. Then it took different forms over the years or the centuries. We had l'État dirigiste. After the war, we had industrial policy. We had a whole bunch of initiatives which put the state at the center of the capitalism in France. And Stéphane mentioned before that the state now owns a single-digit ownership in the overall economy. It used to be much, much bigger than that, etc. So I think we have to give back to Caesar what belongs to Caesar. The state played an enormous role in the development of capitalism in this country and those companies which now are so strong and so powerful around the world. Clearly, there's been a change, and clearly the world is different. This is going back to my earlier comment about the fact that shareholders are treated equally everywhere in the developed market in this country as well. So I don't see that the state now plays it's still very involved in several industries and companies, but I think over the long run this will go.
How do you see it, Anne? You're
I was just going to make a very small comment. The French state is a shareholder in Technicolor, so they're wonderful.
Oh, come on. That's it. All right. How do you see it, Stéphane?
No, I think you have to be granular and specific. As a shareholder and a board member, the role of the state is debatable, as the role of any shareholder would be debatable, as if you would take pension funds and so on. As a shareholder in regulated companies, the role is debatable because it's complicated when you own a regulated entity to make an arbitrage between do you want to have low tariffs for the users, do you want to have strong dividends for the shareholders, or do you want to invest in the network or in the infrastructure. But any shareholder who would have as a mandate the consumers or the users mandate would be conflicted, so it's unfair to blame the state for in the win-win. From a strategic point of view, they may make mistakes. I mean, I don't want to comment what happened in the automotive sector, but I mean, it's debatable about whether one option was better than the other, etc. So what is important is that so far, despite all the weaknesses, and we can spend hours of French state bashing, so far facts show that there is some ways to adjust, to evolve the way they intervene. The way, for example, most of the effort now is done through the Crédit d'Impôt Recherche, the R&D credits.
I just mentioned,
or
yeah.
where the fact that the training or the formation or the development of human capital has never been challenged, or these sort of things are much more fundamental than being a shareholder or a board member. This is the surface of things. What is much more fundamental is the enabler, the fact that fundamentally the most vibrant part of the economy recycles their tax money by they getting all the support in the tech sector. I mean, there are people writing pieces in research institutions, but is the French technology sector being de facto nationalized when you consolidate all the form of supports from local governments, central governments? So the reality is much, much more ambivalent depending on what part of the GDP. I believe that because of the fundamental reasons that Virginie mentioned, which is that the decision makers are much more immersed in globalization. Everyone does an MBA, everyone does works even in the government, is exposed to coronavirus. We run a European company, everyone goes to Amsterdam, to Oslo, everyone knows what the real world is. The capability to adjust to global trends is much higher than what it used to be, even when Michael and I were young and slim and when we started our professional careers and when the world was fundamentally different. By the way, he's still young and slim.
He's so young, isn't he? But Virginie, I mean, you
No, I think on the state, I mean, there's the way I see it, I mean, there was the state ownership in a number of the companies which were mentioned, which is sort of behind us. Privatization have happened. They've sold their stake. They may have been mistake in some situation. I think the other part of the state, which is doing a great job today supporting the development of great companies of different sizes, is BPI.
I agree with that.
You know, FSE in its former form, BPI today, they are trying to launch a new sort of fund.
Yeah.
The idea being, you know, sort of renewed FSE, you know, providing some anchor investor to public companies, trying to provide something close to, you know, long-term or anchor. So, you know, we don't, you know, what we've known sort of 15, 20 years ago, I remember working at Lazard on both the privatization of France Télécom and Renault. I think this is behind us. There's not many, you know, as Stéphane was saying, 2% of the companies are is still being owned by the
we have
state.
some high profile.
But a lot of, you know, the state has evolved. They're investing in a different way. They have super professional team. So, you know, it's public money, but, you know, the approach is sort of similar. And then just thinking of this discussion, I was thinking, you know, let's not forget the, you know, the amazing capitalist families that have been developing tremendous businesses across the years in France. Think of all those companies which have been backed not by the state, but by their own families. And, you know, LVMH or L'Oréal or a number of others. I don't think there's been, you know, so there's many, and I think we've been able to also deploy capital and remain very long term thanks to those companies supported by their families generation after generation with great ambition, great success, and there's many companies in the CAC 40 which are still family owned.
Absolutely.
I mean, did you want to add to
just a very, very quick point, just backing up what Virginie just said. Similar to my experience over the last 20, 25 years and the change in the attention paid to shareholders, the state has completely changed its own attitude and way of running businesses. I remember what it was back then. And I was involved very recently in one of those big car mergers where BPI is our interlocutor and our partner.
Peugeot, one of the three largest shareholders.
It's one of the largest shareholders of Peugeot, but we're dealing with professional people, who fight hard for their interest, but at the same time know exactly what the rules of the game are, etc. We're not dealing with the state. We're dealing with the BPI.
Right.
It's
I
very
agree.
interesting
Yeah.
difference.
And
And nobody
can I-
revisits the decision that was taken, when was it, 10 years ago, when they invested 12% or
Yeah.
something like that?
Yeah, correct.
And it was debatable. There was a change of management. There was a completely risky restructuring ahead of them. And they took the problem is that each country needs some form of anchor, stable
Yes.
long-term shareholders.
And
Other
exactly.
countries have
To
pension funds, we
Stefan's,
don't. What we
exactly.
have is WIG, Pinot,
Peugeot, etc., and BPI. And BPI.
And we have those families. And by the way, we publish every year a survey at Euronext about who are the shareholders of the CAC 40, where we scan very carefully the annual reports and everything. And the largest shareholders are definitely the families, because there is also a corporate effect of LVMH.
And if you're managing a company, especially if it's public, it's easier when it's private. There's nothing more sort of reassuring than having long-term shareholders, either a family or a very long-term pension funds, to be able to transform and bring to your own companies the transformation. Maybe we go back to ESG now, but every transformation, sharing the value is all bringing to what you do at the very core ESG in different manner. You better have long-term shareholders which have the patience to see the return of your investment being either financial resources or talent or time.
Which brings me to the question
point,
about
sorry for
shareholder.
jumping.
Yeah,
My
go ahead.
point is that the state is neither better or worse than a family. A family that is sleeping on a business can kill a business. A family that is agile can grow a business. The state can be very agile or can make mistakes just like a family. So because of the lack of anchor shareholders, the lack of pension funds, and the relative size of the family ownerships, we had these developments, which is part of the history as in terms of size, but has been critical in certain
How does shareholder activists, the rise of the shareholder activists, change some of this dynamic in France? We have certainly seen some situations, but I mean, how do you? I mean, do you have an activist fund yet?
Do you mean did I raise money to be an activist? No.
You going to?
No.
Why not?
I've got my plate is very full with long-term supporting great companies going abroad and developing, so I don't have to do that.
Good answer. I don't know, Michael. I mean, it must be a catalyst, though, in many ways for your business.
Indeed. Perhaps less so in this country than in other jurisdictions in Europe, and certainly far behind what's going on in the US. Do I think activism is coming in a major way here? Possibly not, for all the reasons we've mentioned before. But eventually, there will be some situations deserving activist attention. I am, contrary to many of my colleagues in the banking world, not against activists, playing a role in these markets, and I think this should happen also in this country, although perhaps a bit later.
And I mean, you're the board of Capgemini. Today, the company had a bit of a victory in the sense that your bid for Altran went over 50%. You got more than 50%, even though Elliott Advisors, big U.S. activist fund, had dug its heels in.
Yes, that's. It's always shareholder activism. There's different activists. Yeah, I don't think we can talk about one category. I think you always have shareholders that will come into a particular situation with a view and will ask for some things, and sometimes they'll ask for a board seat, and sometimes they will ask for good change, and in other cases they'll try to make money for themselves and their stakeholders, and then it's about the tools and the ways they go about things. So I think being professional, analyzing a company, asking for a number of things, a lot of shareholders, and it can be the state, and it can be families, and it can be private shareholders, and you can call them activists or not. A lot of them can do that, and it's part of being a good shareholder. The thing that people don't like about shareholder activists is when they either do things that are on the borderline of the law, and that, of course, is not acceptable from whoever, And then it's also in a disruptive situation that's too cozy. So in that case, you could argue for them. In the case of Capgemini, of course, the board is super happy with that result and with the combination, and we hope things will go well and will continue to go well going forward.
Stefan, did you want to make a remark about activists?
Oh, I mean, for me, the big threat to proper functioning of markets is not activist, it's the exponential growth of passive management. Because that's a big issue. When you have 30-40% of some stocks traded by robots or ETFs, then you have a big issue, because you have a pro-cyclical development of valuation, which is very complicated. I guess it pollutes somehow some M&A processes. So as far as activists are concerned, I mean, a good shareholder should be an activist shareholder. And as Anne said, either some of them, the big distinction is not about what you do, but why you do it. It's just like
how.
It's just like you have a gun, and you go in the street with a gun.
I don't.
You can do.
I don't.
No.
That's a difference.
and then you shoot at someone.
Well,
then the facts are very different. You shoot at someone because you were in a state of legitimate defense.
Michael's a little worried.
I think we're going to leave.
I'm shitting Virginie now.
You shoot at someone because you want to be hostile. My point is that an activist depends on what the fundamental intents are. If you own shares and you believe that the company is massively undermanaged by a cozy management that has accumulated mistakes, and that the current dynamic of the shareholders does not change anything, that's the rule of the game. If you are here to break up the company, to use illegal means, to do things that break up, as such, is not an issue. It depends whether it's value creative in the midterm and so on. So I think the idea of having active shareholder, not activist shareholder, is useful.
Yes.
Having very active shareholders is also good news. What is problematic is when people don't show what are their ultimate intent.
Right.
And that's more a matter of disclosing intents than anything else.
So Matt, actually on this note, I'm going to ask you guys 2 questions, and then I'm going to ask you, the panel, another question. Matt, why don't you get your phones out? This is like the only time anyone's ever going to say, hey, please get out your phone while we're having a panel here. But please do. So the question is, which company is most vulnerable to an ESG-related activist campaign? So you can go on there and vote. It's ExxonMobil, BNP Paribas, Saudi Aramco, News Corp, and Total. So come on.
So predictable.
I'm going to vote.
BNP, je suis surprise, moi. BNP?
BNP, je suis surprise, Saudi Aramco.
Okay.
Ah oui, ça.
Come on, no?
C'est quand même étrange, BNP, non? I would love to hear why someone is really... Oh my God.
Nobody wants to go and disrupt News Corp. That's interesting. It ought to be disrupted.
So, what would you guys vote? Michael, what would be your vote?
You can't say.
No?
Any of these could be my client, so.
That's interesting. Saudi Aramco, where we did this in other places, particularly the States, ExxonMobil was the winner. Because partly the question is a little
brand
unfair.
perception. It's about knowing the company, no?
All right. Well, that's probably true. But Saudi Aramco is
business.
good luck with that one. It's a slightly controlled company by Mohammed bin Salman, and good luck with it. But it's certainly somewhat of an ESG question mark. Let's ask the next question. This is a slightly easier one. Which investment will perform best in the coming year? We took a sort of sample here. We changed this up in different places. SoftBank, Masayoshi Son, and his speaking of the sort of endless pool of capital for keeping companies private. Blackstone, the British pound, Société Générale, and crude oil.
It's a very interesting sample. I don't know who this is.
I like it.
Apples and oranges.
There's nothing scientific about it. It's just kind of fun. And it slightly relates to Blackstone. We have a pretty interesting prediction in the book about Blackstone. It's more about the idea.
Have to read it.
And I think
What is it, the prediction?
You have to read it. I'm not going to tell you.
Okay, well, you could summarize it for
We
me.
also have one about SoftBank, and I will tell you there, we do a
teaser.
sum of the parts analysis, suggests the company is trades at about 50% of where it should trade. the year before, we said that it
At
was going
50% discount.
yeah, to its some of its parts.
And
the
last
NAV.
year?
But there are some assumptions in there you probably will disagree with. But the other this year in our previous year's predictions, we said that SoftBank would have to write down the value of many of its investments, which it
Okay.
did, of
Which
course.
he did.
Okay, let me ask you guys, this is sort of a final question. Virginie, I'll start with you since you just came back from Davos. You are a Davos woman. There was lots of talk about sustainability. And I will say, in the discussions I had with people, it's, oh, wait, not that one yet. Hold on, Matt. Put that one aside. That's the fun one for the end. That's dessert.
Okay.
It seems to me that this whole question of sustainability is just, it's gone from PR marketing departments, investors base even, to right into the boardrooms. I mean, they are putting it into the way that they're viewing the world.
That's good. It's high time, no?
Well, I mean, but when you make investments, I mean, how has this changed the way you throw your money
The
into
board
companies?
are finally looking at it. Well, okay. This time I'll talk just about Eurazeo, and then I'll try to tell you what I've seen in the industry, in the private equity industry. So we started 10 years ago. It wasn't really a sort of a strategy, but we were a number of us to be supporting different sort of conviction in different avenues, and collectively, we put it together as a group of sort of MDs, and it became our own, ESG strategy. It's been 10 years. We're investing a lot in terms of talent at Eurazeo level. And then we bring, which is the most interesting part and the most complex part at the same time, we bring to the portfolio company in which we invest, but we have more than 300 ESG knowledge. We measure, we set ambition, we publish. I just believe in what is published and known, and targeting is what works rather than café du commerce. Can I say that? Then we sort of specialize in trying to help our portfolio company at the time, and then progressively, so being very sort of disciplined and focused on what we were bringing, and progressively we've expanded. It's been 5 years in terms of, so in 2014 we announced where we would like to be in terms of at the Eurazeo Group at the end of 2019, so we're going to publish this in about a month. I'm super proud with what we have achieved. It's actually quite complicated when you're a private equity public company, because my scope changes all the time, because we buy and we keep quite long term, but still, a number of companies which were in my portfolio in 2013 or 14, they're not in my portfolio anymore, but still we've taken target and ambition for the group. And then in about sort of, not too long ago, we are going to, during the first half, we're going to publish our next ambition for 2025. I think, whatever the reason, it could be marketing, it could be that you can't do it anymore because it's sort of non-politically correct, so you have to say that you're going to be spending time and effort in ESG, or whether you are deeply convinced and you've been doing it for the last 10 years. I think there's no bad reason to come to ESG. So I'm happy with them all. I think there's a trend. My clients ask me to be ESG compliant. Sovereign funds, insurance company, pension funds, public shareholders, our own clients, clients of our companies. So I don't think there's any way back. I may be wrong. Something might happen which suddenly puts the ESG
a recession
at the bottom of the pile and not at the top of the pile. So I think everything we can do, everything we can do while we can do it. Someone was saying, I think this is either Christine Lagarde, repeigner le toit de la maison pendant qu'il fait beau. So I think there's a lot that you have to do while you can do it, because you don't know what's ahead of you. And once you have process in place, investment, people in charge, it's quite rare that it would sort of disappear or go back. So at least what you've achieved will stay in place.
You think it's here to stay?
Yeah.
How do you see it from the sort of view of stock exchange?
Well, there are two words that we use in our professional life today that we didn't learn at university and that are very material today. The first one is negative interest rates, and the second one is ESG. And clearly, I think something very fundamental happened 2 weeks ago. On Friday, Amundi announced that by the end of 21, I think, they want 100% of their funds to become fully ESG compliant. And the following Tuesday, BlackRock made a very similar announcement. it's really a conversion. When I mean conversion, I mean like Constantin converting to Christianism into 312 or something like that. When the guy decided to bring to Christianism all the infrastructure of the Roman Empire, all the administrative structure of the Roman Empire, and he moved the headquarters of Christianism to the headquarters of the Roman Empire, by the way. I mean, his successors did that well, at least. So it's something as fundamental as that. When you have Larry Fink and all the others saying, this is now the new religion, they are going to inject all the power of the infrastructure of capitalism, and the beauty of the capitalism is its viral dissemination, the strength of dissemination of standards. You go to, I do roadshow, Euronext is a 5.5 billion company. It was not always the case. When we were IPO, when I joined, it was a 1.4 billion company. We quadrupled the size of the company by hard work, but we do a lot of roadshows in Trou du cul du monde in the US, and all sorts of places where you find investors who buy Euronext shares. And you can go to Little Hole, whatever, the great state of whatever, and then you can find people asking you, but what are you doing on the ESG front? And this is a new religion. This is a new reality. Now, that raises one very fundamental question, which is ESG means EXG, but nobody knows what ESG means. And that's a new accounting standard is being created. We are in the process of defining it. And it is very important that we, as Europeans at least, we are on the side of writing the standards rather than taking the standards. And that's a very important battle because it's a new IFRS which is being written in front of us. So
what are they called? The SASB or something like that?
Whatever.
Whatever it is.
SASB.
The taxonomy by the European Commission is very important.
But it's all about climate
what we
and
don't
carbon.
want to be, we prefer to be in a sort of GSM standard type of world rather than in a world where the standards are produced on the West Coast. By the way, in an environment where the leadership in terms of size of investors driven by ESG and the size of companies driven by ESG are more European and Chinese than US.
And I mean, ESG, there's gender equality as part of that. I mean, how when you look at you're on board, so you must have seen a huge. I mean, you're the chair of a board,
yes,
but
yes. And
you're the doctor of AI. I mean.
Yeah, and on gender equality, clearly that's another thing that a lot of the funds are asking for. Again, very recent announcements on that, and that's very good, and that goes in the overall ESG angle. Boards are good, but I mean the main battle or the main important battlefront is executive committees and management positions. So that's where we still need to have a difference being made. On ESG, there's another comment that I wanted to make, which is an interesting one. It's very good to see everyone being committed to that. At the same time, you have the big drive of innovation and all the AI, data science, Bitcoin mining, all of that requires increasingly huge computer capabilities. And that's actually not very ESG friendly.
No, not quite.
Not at all. So I think we see these two things
renewables.
Developing in parallel. Right. And rather than a recession, I think that's probably where we'll see some tension. But interesting to follow.
And so last M&A, is this going to drive deals? Is this going to be, is everybody going to say, I need to own a clean widget maker? And
Look, I don't want to add anything to what was said. I think it was said perfectly well. I'd rather answer this question if I can.
Okay, this is it. Which of these?
Can I do that?
Yeah.
Oui.
Can I do that? Okay.
These
all right, so let me give you a comment. Yeah, let me give you comments. Okay, iPhone, of course, it's going to be around. I mean, how could we live without it? The euro, I am a very passionate European, so it will be around. Internal combustion engines, I love cars, as you know. So I hope it'll still be around. Facebook, my daughter just took a job with Facebook, so I hope it'll be around.
That's okay, she can find
Where
another
does
job.
that leave? Where does that leave us with?
Forex traders.
Who, I've never met, I don't know about you, Anne, I've never met one which earned consistently money. So I'm very happy to see that group disappear.
I'm not, I hope, I think they're a large client base here, so I'm
not
sure I agree with that. But look, thank you all very much. We don't have time for questions. You'll have to accost these great panelists afterwards. I think there's drinks in the other room. So